Catherine Vale fired her quiet driver in a Chicago hotel lobby, in front of the board and a cluster of reporters, all because he arrived 3 minutes late. Mason Carter did not argue. He only lowered his eyes and handed over the final set of keys. But when 3 strangers surged forward and dragged Catherine toward a black SUV, every face in the lobby went still. In exactly 2 seconds, the man she had just dismissed moved like a trained operator, dropping every threat before anyone could scream. And Catherine understood, far too late, the gravest mistake of her life. If this story pulls you in, stay with us to the end to learn the secret behind those fateful seconds. The Ashcombe Grand rose above downtown Chicago in glass and steel, its lobby polished to a shine that swallowed every sound but the click of expensive shoes. Catherine Vale moved through that lobby, the way she moved through everything, fast, certain, already 3 steps ahead of the room. She was set to meet a group of investors that afternoon, men who controlled enough capital to make or break the merger her company had spent a year chasing. The stakes sat on her shoulders like a second spine, and she carried them the only way she knew how, by trusting no one and forgiving nothing. Even the small courtesies of the morning felt like obligations to her, greetings exchanged without warmth, nods given without patience, the entire lobby simply another obstacle standing between her and the deal she needed to close. Mason Carter waited near the revolving doors in a plain black suit, standing the way he always stood, spine straight, hands loose at his sides, eyes moving across every exit in the room without ever seeming to move at all. He was quiet in a way that unsettled people who did not know him and reassured the very few who did. That morning he had noticed something wrong beneath the rear bumper of Catherine's car, a small transmitter tucked where no ordinary mechanic would think to look. He had stopped to remove it, and that decision cost him 3 minutes. He walked into the lobby prepared to explain himself. He never got the chance. Logan Pierce, the company's head of security, stepped in front of him before a single word could leave his mouth, telling the assembled board members in a voice pitched for an audience that the driver had shown up late again, that his carelessness was an embarrassment to a CEO trying to close the most important deal of the year. Logan's timing was too clean, his outrage too rehearsed, but no one in that lobby was listening closely enough to notice. Catherine was already raw from a week of leaked headlines and a boardroom that doubted her judgment, and Logan's words landed on that rawness like a match to dry grass. She turned to Mason and told him, in front of the reporters gathering by the entrance, that he was finished. She held out her hand for the keys without waiting for an explanation, without asking a single question about where he had been or why. It was easier in that moment to be furious at someone standing still than to examine the fire around her. Somewhere beneath the anger sat exhaustion, the accumulated weight of a year spent defending decisions she had not fully believed in herself. Mason did not argue. He reached into his coat, drew out the set of keys, and placed them into her palm without a flicker of protest crossing his face. The only thing he said, low enough that only she and Logan heard it, was that she should leave through the rear entrance rather than the front. Catherine took it as one final act of defiance, a driver too proud to admit fault even as he was dismissed. She turned her back on him and walked toward the cameras waiting outside. A photographer near the doors lifted his camera and caught the moment anyway, Mason standing motionless while the woman he had protected for 2 years walked away without looking back. Whispers moved through the small crowd of board members, amused, a little cruel, the kind of whispers that turn a person into a story before the day is even over. Mason became, in the space of 30 seconds, a punchline standing in an expensive lobby, and nobody thought to wonder why a man who had just lost his job was still watching the doors instead of leaving through them. That was when the air in the lobby changed, so subtly that only Mason seemed to register it. 3 men entered from 3 different directions, spaced with a precision that had nothing to do with coincidence, and Mason's eyes, still scanning out of old habit, caught the pattern before his mind had even finished naming it as a threat. The polished floor, the roped-off press line, the whole gleaming machinery of the afternoon, none of it mattered anymore. Somewhere beneath his calm, discarded exterior, the old training was already awake. The first man moved toward Catherine with the camera raised, as though he were simply another journalist eager for a photograph, but Mason recognized the grip on the device as wrong, too tight, too deliberate for someone who actually cared about the shot. The second man drifted toward Catherine's 2-person security detail, positioning himself to block their line of sight at the exact moment it mattered most. The third slipped toward the curb where a black SUV idled with its rear door already cracked open, waiting. Logan, standing only a few feet away, reacted a half-second too slowly, his hands rising in a performance of alarm that did not match the calculation in his eyes. Mason clocked that hesitation too, filed it away, and moved. This was not a random assault or a desperate theft. It carried the shape of something planned, something rehearsed by people who had studied Catherine's schedule closely enough to know exactly where she would be standing and exactly when her guard would be down. In the span of 2 seconds, the quiet driver, who had just been publicly humiliated, became someone else entirely. He closed the distance to the first man before the fake camera ever reached its target, seizing his wrist and twisting it until the device clattered to the marble floor. He used his own body as a wall between Catherine and the second attacker, absorbing the shove meant for her, and drove his elbow into the man's forearm with enough force to send a weapon skittering harmlessly across the polished stone. Catherine felt herself pulled backward, hard, until a marble column stood between her and the chaos unfolding just beyond it. She had no memory of deciding to move. Mason had simply placed her there, the way a person moves furniture out of the path of a falling shelf. The third man reached for her only to find Mason already between them, and the fight ended the way it began, without shouting, without spectacle, a single controlled motion that left the man folded against the floor before anyone in the lobby understood what they were witnessing. For a full breath, the room simply stared. 3 strangers lay subdued across the marble, and the man responsible for putting them there stood at the center of it, breathing evenly, his suit barely wrinkled. Catherine stared at him from behind the column, and for the first time in longer than she could recall, she had absolutely nothing to say. The driver she had fired 90 seconds earlier had just placed himself, without hesitation, between her and whatever those men had intended. Somewhere beneath the shock, a colder thought began forming, that whoever had planned this had known things about her schedule that only someone inside the company should have known. Mason knelt briefly beside the first attacker and lifted a small transmitter from his jacket pocket, identical in make to the one he had removed from beneath Catherine's car that morning. He crossed the lobby and placed it in Amelia Grant's palm without a word of explanation, though the warning in his eyes needed none. He told her, quietly enough that only she could hear, that whoever had planned this had known the schedule down to the minute, and that kind of knowledge did not come from strangers. Logan recovered his composure first, already pivoting toward damage control, insisting loudly to anyone who would listen that the driver had used excessive force, that a trained professional would have subdued the men without such violence. It was the kind of statement designed to shift a room's sympathy, and under different circumstances it might have worked. Mason did not answer him. He only turned and looked at Logan for a long moment, a look that carried no anger, only a quiet, unhurried certainty that he already understood exactly who had made the call to send those men. Something in that silence unsettled Logan far more than a shouted accusation ever could have, and he found an excuse to step away before the moment stretched any longer. Police arrived within minutes, cordoning off the lobby while paramedics checked the 3 men who had tried to take Catherine. Mason answered their questions in short, exact sentences, giving them nothing about himself beyond what the incident required. When one officer asked where he had learned to move like that, Mason only said that he had spent time in the service years ago and left it there. He offered no unit name, no rank, no story worth repeating, and something in his tone made the officer decide not to press further. Catherine stood apart from the questioning, replaying the last 2 years in her head with a clarity she had never allowed herself before. She remembered how Mason always checked the mirrors twice before pulling away from a curb, how he memorized every exit of every building they entered, how he had once rerouted her entire schedule without explanation, and she had thought him strange rather than careful. She had built a story about him in her mind. Quiet meant slow, careful meant timid, and every piece of that story had just collapsed on the marble floor in front of her. Amelia found a moment alone with Catherine near the hotel's side entrance and told her, in a low and urgent voice, that Mason had flagged security gaps in the building's schedule 3 separate times over the past 2 months, and that each report had vanished before it reached Catherine's desk. She had assumed at the time that the reports were simply lost in the usual bureaucratic churn. Standing in the aftermath of an attempted kidnapping, that explanation no longer felt like an accident. Catherine demanded to see Mason's personnel file the moment she returned to her office that evening, expecting the usual thin record of a contract driver, some references, a background check, nothing remarkable. What she found instead unsettled her more than the attack itself. Great stretches of his employment history were blank, entire years reduced to a single line of unclassified text, as though someone had gone through his record with careful, deliberate scissors. She called Jackson Reed, the firm's internal counsel, and asked him to dig further, half expecting him to find nothing at all. Jackson called back within the hour, his voice lower than usual, telling her that Mason's early record connected to a specialized unit whose files were sealed at a level well above anything the company's counsel could access. He said it the way a man says something he is not entirely sure he should be saying out loud. Catherine sat with that information long after Jackson's call ended, thinking of every small kindness Mason had extended without asking for credit. The times he had quietly placed himself between her and an aggressive photographer. The night he had noticed a stranger loitering near her car and rerouted their path without a word of alarm. She had mistaken his restraint for weakness for 2 years, and now she understood it as something closer to discipline, the kind that came from a life she had never bothered to ask about. She found herself replaying small conversations from months earlier, moments where he had offered a warning she had waved away without a second thought, wondering now how many of those warnings had actually mattered. Mason left the hotel that night without asking for his job back, without waiting for an apology, without accepting so much as a word of thanks from the woman he had just protected. Before he walked out through the same rear entrance he had once told her to use, he paused only long enough to say one thing, quiet and even, that she should stop trusting any schedule that came to her through Logan Pierce. He did not wait to see how she took it, disappearing into the night the same way he had always moved through rooms without fanfare, without needing anyone to notice him leave. Within days, Catherine began to see the shape of something far larger than a single failed attack. The merger her company had spent a year building was quietly being pulled off course, small clauses shifting in her favor one week and against her the next. Terms she did not remember approving appearing in drafts she had supposedly already signed. It took a long, sleepless night of comparing documents before she understood that someone inside her own walls was steering the deal toward collapse. Jackson traced the thread back to Logan, uncovering evidence that he had sold Catherine's travel schedule to a rival firm eager to force her signing an unfavorable clause before the board could intervene. The kidnapping at the hotel had never been intended to harm her. It had been designed to make her disappear for a handful of hours, just long enough for the board to vote emergency authority into someone else's hands while she was unreachable and unable to object. Amelia dug further and found an exchange of encrypted messages between Logan and a private security contractor posing as a legitimate protection firm, the kind of company that existed on paper and nowhere else. Jackson followed the money and located an offshore account under Logan's name that had received a substantial transfer only hours before the investor meeting, timed with a precision that left no real room for coincidence or misunderstanding. Catherine wanted to call Mason that same night, to ask him to come back, to admit outright how badly she had misjudged him, but pride kept her hand away from the phone longer than she would ever admit to anyone. She told herself it was strategy, that she needed more evidence before making a move, though some smaller and more honest part of her understood that she was simply afraid of what it would mean to ask for help from a man she had discarded in front of a room full of cameras. Mason, meanwhile, had returned to the quiet apartment he kept above a hardware store on the edge of the city, folding his driving jacket over the back of a chair with the same care he gave to everything. He opened a drawer he rarely touched and set an old service pin beside his keys, not out of nostalgia but out of habit, the way a soldier checks a weapon he hopes never to need again. He had built a small, deliberately unremarkable life for himself, one built around discipline and distance from the world that had once demanded everything of him. He kept that life separate from the people who depended on him outside of work, the quiet responsibilities that lived beyond the hours he spent behind the wheel, never spoken of at the office and never allowed to intersect with it. It was part of why he moved through the world the way he did, watchful and economical, a man who had learned the value of keeping the things he cared about far from the reach of danger. That instinct had cost him relationships once, before he understood how to balance vigilance with an ordinary life, and he had no intention of repeating those old mistakes now. Even in his own apartment, half convinced he wanted nothing more to do with corporate schedules and boardroom politics, Mason found himself unable to set the matter down entirely. He kept the folded map of the hotel's lower level on his kitchen table, along with a photograph he had taken of the transmitter before handing it to Amelia. Catherine was still in danger, whether she understood the full shape of it yet or not, and some old, stubborn instinct in him refused to walk away from that fact. He told himself it was simply thoroughness, the same habit that had once kept him and the people around him alive, but somewhere beneath that explanation sat something less easily labeled, a reluctance to abandon a problem only half solved. Catherine found the garage on a quiet side street, a narrow shop with its bay door half raised and the sound of a wrench turning somewhere inside. She had come alone without her usual trailing entourage of aides and drivers, leaving only Amelia waiting near the corner with the engine running, close enough to help if needed and far enough to give Catherine room to face this on her own terms. Mason was underneath an old sedan when she arrived, sleeves rolled to the elbow, entirely unhurried by the sound of expensive heels on concrete. He slid out, wiped his hands on a rag, and waited for her to speak first, offering nothing that might make this easier for her. Catherine told him she wanted him back, that she would match whatever salary he wanted, that the position was his the moment he said yes. Mason shook his head slowly and told her that was not the problem, and it had never been about the money. She asked what the problem was, and he answered without softening it, telling her plainly that she still did not trust him. Not really, not in the way that mattered. He reminded her that she had believed a stranger's version of events over 2 years of quiet, consistent loyalty simply because the stranger spoke louder and with more confidence. Catherine opened her mouth to argue and found she had nothing to say, because he was right, and they both knew it. The garage around them stayed quiet except for the drip of a faucet somewhere in the back, and neither of them rushed to fill the silence that followed. For the first time since the lobby, she said the words out loud, that she had been wrong to fire him in front of everyone, wrong to assume the worst of him without asking a single question. It cost her more than she expected to say it plainly, without qualification, without the practiced deflections she used in every boardroom. Mason studied her for a long moment, weighing the admission the way he weighed everything, carefully and without haste. He told her the real failure was not about a job title at all, but about who she had allowed to stand closest to her, and how she had let a man like Logan whisper in her ear while pushing away the ones who actually meant her well. The words landed harder than she expected, striking at something she had spent years avoiding, the quiet suspicion that her own judgment about people had never been as sharp as her judgment about numbers. Mason finally agreed to help her one last time, though he made clear it was not for the paycheck and not for his own reputation. It was because if Logan succeeded in seizing control of the company, dozens of employees who had done nothing wrong would lose their jobs in the fallout, and that mattered to him more than any personal grievance he carried. He set one condition before agreeing to anything further, that for the next full day, every decision touching Catherine's security would run through him alone, without interference from anyone else in the building. Catherine accepted without argument, something she rarely did with anyone. Walking back to the car, she understood that whatever existed between them now had shifted into something new, no longer employer and driver, not yet something either of them could name, but an uneasy alliance built on the fragile beginnings of earned respect. She glanced back once at the open garage door before Amelia pulled away, watching Mason return to the sedan he had been repairing as though nothing at all had changed, and found herself oddly comforted by how little he seemed to need her approval. Mason spent the day building a version of events that would look, to anyone watching from outside, exactly like the truth. He let word circulate that Catherine intended to follow her usual route to the board dinner that evening, the same car, the same driver rotation, the same predictable timing that Logan had exploited once already. Beneath that surface, everything had changed, the vehicle swapped, the entry point altered, the outside security detail replaced with a smaller team Mason trusted completely. He walked the building twice that morning alone, checking blind spots and stairwells with the same meticulous patience he had once applied to far more dangerous ground, leaving nothing to chance this time. Amelia played her part carefully, feeding a slightly altered version of the schedule to Logan through a contact she knew he monitored, watching to see whether he would take the bait or grow suspicious of the timing. He took it without hesitation, confident that his access remained unquestioned, and gave the order for a second team to wait in the hotel's underground level, ready to move the moment Catherine arrived for the evening's board dinner. Catherine had to walk into that dinner as though she knew nothing at all, laughing at the right moments, discussing the merger with investors who had no idea how close they had come to losing everything 2 weeks earlier. It took every ounce of composure she had built over a career of controlled boardrooms to keep her voice steady while knowing what was likely unfolding just floors beneath her feet. Mason stood near the edge of the room in his old post, a driver again in appearance only, watching every door and every face with the same unhurried attentiveness he had always carried, though now every one of the guests in that room was a suspect until proven otherwise. Logan mocked him openly in front of several shareholders, calling him a lucky hire who had simply stumbled into the right place at the right time, a remark meant to needle a man who refused to rise to it. Mason said nothing in response, and his silence unsettled Logan more than any retort could have. Jackson worked quietly from a side office, preparing the legal groundwork to freeze the offshore accounts the moment enough evidence was in hand, coordinating with a contact at the bureau who had agreed to move the instant Catherine gave the word. The tension in the room thickened as the evening wore on, the chandeliers throwing warm light over conversations that felt, to Catherine, increasingly hollow, every polite exchange with an investor a thin layer stretched over something far darker moving beneath the building. She kept her hands steady around her glass, kept her voice pitched exactly where it needed to be, drawing on years of practice at appearing calm while everything underneath her ran cold. Jackson checked his phone twice beneath the table, waiting on confirmation from his contact that the freeze order was ready to be executed the instant it was needed, and Amelia drifted near the room's entrance, positioned to intercept anyone trying to slip out unnoticed. The whole evening had become a kind of performance, everyone in on a script except the one man who believed he was the only one holding the pen. Catherine's phone buzzed once against the table, a message with no name attached, instructing her to come down to the underground level alone if she wanted to keep her company. She read it twice, her pulse rising despite every rehearsal, and glanced across the room toward Mason, who had already noticed the shift in her posture and understood, without a single word passing between them, that the moment they had been waiting for had finally arrived. Catherine descended to the underground level exactly as instructed, her heels echoing against the concrete in a way that felt louder than it had any right to be, the fluorescent lights overhead humming faintly against the silence of the empty parking structure. Every step felt heavier than the last, though she kept her chin level and her expression composed, refusing to let whatever waited below see even a flicker of the fear tightening in her chest. Mason moved through the building's service corridors on a separate path, following a route through the blind spots of the camera system that he had mapped out earlier that day, staying just far enough behind to remain unseen while never losing sight of where she was headed. He moved without sound, the old instincts guiding his feet across concrete and steel with the same quiet certainty they had guided him across far more dangerous ground years before. Logan was waiting for her near the loading bay, and he made no effort to hide behind pretense any longer. He told her, almost gently, that her arrogance had blinded her to the fact that the person closest to her had been working against her for months, and that pride like hers always found a way to collapse eventually. He held up his phone, intending to record her signing a document that would hand emergency authority to a temporary board he had already arranged, insurance against every version of the evening that did not end in his favor. The men positioned around the loading bay assumed the driver they had heard about was gone for good, dismissed weeks earlier and unlikely to reappear, and that assumption cost them the only advantage they had. Mason stepped out from behind a support column with the same unhurried calm he carried into every room, pulling off his driving gloves finger by finger as though he had all the time in the world. The overhead lights caught the edge of his jaw as he moved, and for the first time since the meeting began, Logan's confidence visibly wavered. Logan laughed at first, certain the sight of one man was no threat to the four he had brought with him. But the laugh died in his throat the moment Mason moved, closing the distance to the nearest attacker and disabling him with a single precise strike before the man had time to raise his hands. The fight that followed was economical rather than dramatic, no wasted motion, no theatrics, only the calm application of skill against men who had clearly never expected to need it. Catherine watched from where Mason had positioned her, safely behind a concrete pillar, as he moved through the remaining threats one by one without ever losing his composure, protecting her the entire time without a single unnecessary blow. She understood, watching him work, that this was not violence for its own sake but something closer to discipline, a man doing exactly what was required and nothing more. Amelia and Jackson arrived moments later with a team of real security personnel and 2 uniformed officers close behind, the freeze order already executed and the evidence of Logan's transfers displayed clearly on the screen of a phone one of the officers held out toward him. Logan's protest dissolved almost immediately once the numbers on that screen made any denial pointless. The string of encrypted messages and offshore deposits laid bare for everyone standing in that loading bay to see. He was led away in handcuffs while Catherine finally allowed herself to breathe, one long, shaking exhale that she had been holding since the moment she stepped off the elevator. She looked at Mason across the wreckage of the loading bay, at the calm way he stood among the men he had just subdued, and understood with sudden clarity how close she had come to losing everything to a man she had trusted simply because he spoke with confidence in a room full of people too tired to question him. In the days following Logan's arrest, Catherine asked Jackson to tell her everything he had learned about Mason's past, no longer content to leave the question buried beneath sealed files and polite silence. Jackson explained carefully that Mason had once belonged to a specialized unit tasked with hostage recovery and the protection of high-value targets in some of the most volatile places in the world, work that demanded absolute precision and absolute discretion in equal measure. He warned her that most of what remained on record would stay classified regardless of how many favors she called in, and that Mason himself was likely the only person who could fill in the rest if he ever chose to. Mason had no interest in letting that history become a headline or a bargaining chip for the company's public relations team, and when Catherine raised the subject directly, he made that clear without hesitation. He told her he had left that life behind after a mission that cost him his trust in the people who gave the orders from behind a desk, safe distances away from the consequences of their decisions, and he had no desire to relive it for anyone's benefit. He spoke of it the way a person speaks of an old injury, briefly, without drama, unwilling to let it define the rest of the conversation. Catherine finally understood why he had spent 2 years saying so little about himself, why he answered questions with the fewest possible words, and never once volunteered a story about where he had been or what he had done. It was never a matter of pride or shyness. He was not afraid of being underestimated by people who barely knew him. He was afraid of being pulled back into a world he had worked hard to leave behind, one careless invitation at a time. She thought of how easily she had labeled his silence as a lack of ambition, when in truth it had been the opposite, a man guarding something so carefully that most people never even noticed there was anything there to guard. She apologized again, and this time it carried none of the polish she usually brought to her words in a boardroom. She spoke not as the chief executive addressing an employee, but simply as a person who had wronged another person, plainly and without the careful hedging she used to protect herself from vulnerability. It was, she realized as she said it, the first apology she had offered in years that was not calculated to serve some larger purpose. Mason did not offer forgiveness right away, and he made no pretense of softening the moment for her comfort. He told her that trust was not something restored by an apology alone, however sincere, but by what a person chose to do once the truth had finally come into the light. He watched her carefully as he said it, gauging whether the words would land as another lesson she would forget by morning, or something she might actually carry with her. Still, something in his posture eased slightly as he said it, a door left open rather than shut, and Catherine chose to take that as the beginning of something rather than an ending. She left him that afternoon without pressing for more, understanding at last that some things could not be rushed, no matter how urgently she wanted to make amends for the damage her carelessness had caused. The shareholder meeting convened 2 weeks later in a room already thick with rumor, whispers that Catherine had lost control of her own company's security, that a driver's violent outburst in a hotel lobby had exposed dangerous instability at the top. Reporters had run half a dozen versions of the story, most of them wrong in some crucial detail, and the confusion had given a small faction of shareholders exactly the opening they needed. A small faction of shareholders, sensing an opportunity, began quietly pushing for her resignation, framing the entire episode as evidence that she could no longer be trusted to steer the company through its next chapter. Catherine had faced hostile boardrooms before, but never one built on a story this close to true, and she understood that only complete honesty would carry her through it. Catherine walked into that room and did something she had never done before in front of a board. She stood at the head of the table and accepted responsibility without qualification, admitting plainly that she had trusted the wrong person and fired the right one, and that both mistakes had nearly cost the company everything. There was no spin in her voice, no careful redirection towards someone else's failure, only a direct accounting of her own misjudgment laid bare for the room to weigh. She laid out the evidence of Logan's betrayal methodically, the encrypted messages, the offshore transfers, the falsified reports that had buried Mason's warnings for months before anyone in leadership saw them, and she made certain the room understood that the man responsible for exposing all of it was the same driver she had publicly dismissed weeks earlier. Mason had no interest in appearing before the board and told her as much, uncomfortable with the idea of being paraded as a hero for doing what he considered simply the right thing. Amelia spent an hour convincing him otherwise, arguing that his silence would let Logan's version of events linger in the minds of shareholders who had not seen what actually happened that night. Mason finally relented and stepped into the room quietly, standing near the back rather than at the center of attention, though every eye in the room found him within seconds regardless of where he chose to stand. He kept his hands folded in front of him, unmoved by the attention, waiting for Catherine to finish rather than volunteering a single word of his own. Catherine addressed the room directly, telling them plainly that the man standing at the back had not stumbled into heroism by luck, as Logan once claimed, but had used discipline built over years of training to stop an attempted coup against the very company that had discarded him without a second thought. When the footage from that lobby played across the screen, showing the full 2 seconds in stark and undeniable clarity, the room fell into a silence heavier than any applause could have been. Mason declined any senior title offered to him that day, agreeing only to serve as a temporary security advisor while the company rebuilt its systems from the ground up. Catherine used the momentum of that meeting to establish a new fund dedicated to protecting frontline employees from being scapegoated by falsified reports, rewriting the policies that had once allowed a man like Logan to bury the truth without consequence for months at a time. She made a point of telling the board that the fund existed because of Mason, whether he wanted the credit or not, and for once he did not argue with her about it. A few weeks later, the company had settled into a steadier rhythm than it had known in months. Logan faced formal charges. The security contractors he had hired quickly began naming the wider network behind them, eager to trade information for leniency once the evidence against them became impossible to deny. What had once looked like a single betrayal unraveled into something far larger, a web Catherine was relieved to see fully exposed rather than left to fester beneath the surface of her company. Catherine changed the way she led almost immediately, making a habit of listening to the people whose voices had once been easiest to overlook, checking facts herself before accepting the loudest version of any story placed in front of her. It was a smaller shift than anyone outside the company would ever notice, but those who worked closest to her felt the difference within days, a leader finally willing to ask questions before rendering judgment. Mason returned to the company, though not as a driver in the way he had once been. He took on the work of rebuilding its security systems from the foundation up, designing protocols meant to catch exactly the kind of quiet sabotage that had nearly cost Catherine everything, while keeping the same understated presence that had always defined him. He never asked for recognition, and the company had learned, at last, not to offer it in ways he would refuse. Employees who had once whispered about the driver who lost his temper now spoke of him differently, with a kind of quiet respect that no press release could have manufactured. Catherine found him one evening standing near the entrance of the same hotel where it had all begun, the marble floor gleaming under the same lights, the same revolving doors turning behind him. She told him that the place used to remind her of her worst mistake, and now it reminded her of the moment she had finally learned to be humble enough to admit one. Mason handed her the keys to the car parked outside, though this time there was no urgency in the gesture, no dismissal waiting behind it. Catherine did not take them the way a CEO takes something owed to her. She simply asked, plainly, whether he would be willing to drive her to the next meeting on her calendar, the question carrying none of the old authority she once assumed automatically. Mason told her he would on one condition, that she remember to check the rear entrance before ever walking through the front door of any building again. Catherine smiled, the first easy smile anyone had seen from her in weeks, and the two of them walked out together into the evening air, neither of them saying much of anything more, though something quieter and steadier than words had clearly begun to take root between them. Behind them, the hotel's revolving doors kept turning, catching the last of the daylight, indifferent to everything that had changed since the afternoon it had once witnessed her worst mistake. If this story reminded you that the quietest person in the room can often be the strongest protector, share what stayed with you. If you were Catherine, would you have found the courage to apologize to someone you had wronged in front of a crowd, before ever knowing the truth?